If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description. Additionally, if you would like to request novels and access my Google Drive where I have 200 plus audiobooks, then you can join my Patreon. Link is also provided in the description.
Chapter 1, Reincarnation is a bitch. You know how every one of those reincarnation stories have the main character just show up in a new world just fine and totally not on the verge of death? Yet I didn't get that treatment. Instead, what I got was 1 second making a deal with some weird blinding thing. I refused to consider whatever that was a person, and the next I was screaming because it was like a truck hit me and I didn't have the good luck to die immediately. The next part got a bit fuzzy. Look, I'm not making excuses or anything, but I legitimately can't recall exactly what happened as panic set in and I tried to do anything I could to fix myself. All I know was I felt a surge of something rush out of me before I passed out. When I came to next, I wasn't in pain anymore and was in for quite the shock. First thing I noticed was that I was half naked with only a simply pair of rough shorts on. When I say rough, I mean it too, as it was like burlap or something with literal rope holding the waist up. The second thing I noticed, however, was that on my chest and stomach were black markings like a tattoo I definitely didn't have before. It probably would have looked badass if I wasn't kinda out of shape and had a little bit of a belly on me, not fat mind you. It looked kinda like a ring of flames with a weird symbol in the middle of it. At the back of my mind I somehow knew exactly what the markings represented, my cursed technique Hell's Forge. I instinctively knew what the technique did, but that didn't mean I couldn't be a little irritated that I had no idea how to use it. With a sigh, I could only choose to ignore that for now and take a look around to see where the hell I was. Trees, plants, and rocks as far as I can see. This tells me nothing beyond the fucking obvious. I'm in a forest. I thought with a groan. What was it all those survivor shows kept saying about situations like this? I think it was to head west, maybe. I muttered before checking the sun's position. To this I just looked at the shadows the trees cast. I watched the shadows for a good hour or so before I felt confident that I had figured out which direction I should go. Even if the sun sets in the east or north or some other weird shit in this world, I at least know I have a direction of some sort. I thought with a smile as I ventured forth. Fuck. Shit. Damn it. Ow. I cursed like a particularly verbal sailor as I walked, because as I failed to realize previously, walking barefoot through a forest is actually painful as hell. Every few steps on the otherwise soft forest floor led to me stepping on a small sharp rock or hidden stick, or my personal favorite, antlers. Did you know deer apparently shed those damn things? Because I very much did not until now, and believe me, stepping on them barefoot is not a fun experience. I kept them though as I was trying to get my technique to work, since some shoes would be fan-fucking-tastic. My technique Hell's Forge was quite simple in how it worked and had a lot of potential, kinda why I chose it. The way it worked was that I could take anything that came from a living being and through the technique forge it into a different shape by my own imagination. Deer antlers qualified obviously, so I wanted to forge the ones I had collected via stepping on them into a pair of slip-on shoes, Crocs. My problem came in the form of me not actually having cursed energy to use the technique. No fucking idea how that happened, to be honest with you, as an innate technique and cursed energy to use said cursed technique were kinda a package deal, but here I was with a technique and no energy. The worst part was that I know for a fact that the energy I did have was not the curse variety. Why? Because none of my anger at the constant pain in my feet was doing anything to it at all, of course. The energy just flowed through my body in a nice calm manner regardless of how I tried to get it to do anything at all. Honestly speaking, if it wasn't for the pain in my feet, I might even appreciate the view, as like most forests it was kinda nice in this one, cool yet warm and full of life. As a result, I noticed immediately when shit got quiet all of a sudden. Gah-hee. I heard a sound coming from my left and my attention narrowed in on it as a sort of primal fear came to me. The sort of feeling one might get at the zoo when a lion attacks the glass separating you from them. I knew why too the moment the source of the sound jumped into view. A humanoid creature standing about 4 feet tall with green skin and a scrawny build holding a wooden club, a goblin. The creature's weird yellow eyes that reminded me of a goat's locked onto me, and my fight or flight instinct kicked in. I immediately got in a boxing stance while holding an antler in my hand like it was a weapon. Thudump thudump. My heartbeat was the only sound I heard as it pounded in my ears, and I prepared to enter a tango of life and death with the very much hostile monster. Thwack. An arrow came out of seemingly nowhere and sank into the goblin's forehead before I could, however. The creature fell on its back without any fanfare and twitched a bit before going still. It was so sudden that I couldn't even flinch before my foe was dead. This didn't make me relax, however, as logic told me that whatever or whoever killed the thing might be a far bigger threat. You can relax, if we wanted you dead you wouldn't even realize it before you hit the ground. A female voice spoke from behind me, causing me to leap away from the sound by reflex. Rather twitchy this one, Captain? Another female voice asked, sounding amused. From the shadows around me several women walked out where I could see them in various types of clothing including metal armor and even some that were wearing almost nothing at all. Those ones I noticed all had dark hair and skin and were eyeing me in a way that made me uncomfortable. A woman who appeared 20ish like me with reddish-brown hair and a green cloth shirt with no sleeves and brown leather pants with a sash and gloves spoke. I am the captain of the Artemis Familia, Rethusa. Why are you here in the forest? And why do you lack any clothes beyond those shorts? She demanded with a serious expression. Chapter 2, Artemis Familia. I honestly have no idea. First thing I remember was waking up in that direction about 4 hours ago and following the sun to try and reach civilization. I said with a shrug while pointing the direction I came from originally. You seem awfully calm for someone lost in the woods. Rethusa said questioningly. No point in panicking as far as I am concerned, not like it would help to do so after all. I said honestly. I truly meant it too, as I knew that I was in a different world from Earth, but nowhere in the history of ever has panicking done anyone any good on more than an accidental basis. I watched enough movies to know that panicking typically gets you killed instead and tried to use my head for this situation. Rethusa looked at one of the scantily clad dark-skinned women and ordered her to follow my tracks to verify my story. As for you, my goddess will decide what should be done with you. The redhead said coolly. I was confused about something and asked a question that I probably shouldn't have from the reaction it got. By goddess do you mean figuratively or metaphorically or something like that? I asked and all the women froze. You don't know? One of the women asked in shock, an expression they all shared. Something tells me I asked a stupid question, can someone explain why? I asked with a bad feeling. A goddess from heaven, like all the gods and goddesses. Rethusa said and I shook my head. Not ringing any bells, I'm afraid. I said honestly. What exactly do you know about the world at large? Rethusa asked with an expression that said she had a clue what was going on. Well let's see, there's my name. I know how to speak and write and I know how to count money. That's about it though, on second thought that's probably not good, is it? I asked with a frown. I had this sneaky suspicion that I was missing some very important information about this world that was making me stand out badly to these women who were from here originally. Amnesia, do you have any wounds on your head? Rethusa asked seriously. I patted my head and sure enough on the back of it there was a lump I didn't notice until I touched it. I nodded and she sighed. You were probably traveling on the road nearby to Orario and got mugged by bandits. One of them probably hit you in the head and messed up your memory. She said and all the other women looked at me in pity. If you say so. Any idea what happens from here? I asked with a shrug. You are a strange man. Rethusa said but paused when she realized I hadn't introduced myself. Alexander Drake, but I prefer Alex. Plus I think I'll take that as a compliment since being normal is overrated. I said with a chuckle and a smirk. If you say so. She sent back with a smirk of her own before continuing. Anyway, to answer your previous question about what comes next, we will wait for our goddess Artemis to find us before likely escorting you to Orario and then to the guild, who should be able to help you further. She said seriously. Judging from what was said earlier, literal gods and goddesses walk the land, and I can only hope that this version of Artemis isn't like the one I am familiar with. I thought with a shiver at the myths involved with the Greek goddess and men. To explain the old Greek myths about the goddess by that name all but painted her as someone who was not on the best of terms with the male population. There were some downright disturbing myths involved with her punishing men who peeked at her bathing or something like that. Now I was not a pervert or anything like that, but I wasn't nervous at the idea of meeting such a being. Not to mention this was a literal deity we are talking about here, which was concerning enough by itself. After about 30 minutes a group of women with one in particular that caught my attention showed up. The one my attention was focused on was beautiful with strangely perfect proportions and long tied-up blue hair and green eyes. She had this presence to her that made me feel in awe as well. That must be the goddess then. Strange that other than the weird sensation she gives off, she appears no different from a normal human. I thought as Rethusa explained the situation. The blue-haired woman looked at me. Is what my captain true? She asked seriously. What? Sorry, I was lost in my thoughts, can you say that again? I asked an awkward smile. My captain told me of your story, is it true? The blue-haired woman asked again sternly. As far as I know though, for reasons that are obvious, that isn't that very far at all, it happens. I said with a shrug since I didn't really care. And you truly didn't know of the gods walking the world? The woman asked curiously. I shook my head. Nope, real kick in the head that bit, pun very much intended. I said with a laugh at my own joke. Are you insane? She asked with a funny expression as she tilted her head to the side slightly. I shrugged. Maybe just a little, but I won't tell anyone if you don't. I said with a grin. Whatever the case, my familia will see you to the guild in Orario, worry not. She said seriously while ignoring my antics. And there's that word again, familia. What does that even mean anyways? I asked curiously. As I was led out of the forest, I got a rundown of the very abridged world history but could get the gist of the situation. Basically, this world had something known as the dungeon that spawned monsters that invaded the rest of the world for some reason, and the gods created heroes to fight back using their spirit partners before at some point descending from heaven themselves to give their blessings to the mortals here. The ones who got these blessings were known as adventurers and grew through effort, battle, and feats in groups under their respective gods called familias. In my current company, for example, each of these women had Artemis's blessing and as such were her familia. There were also multiple races in this world as well. As I said, though, this was a heavily abridged version of the world history and there was more details I would learn later. Being an adventurer sounds like a fun idea. Might even have been my original plan before I wound up in that forest. I said after my brief history lesson was over. Well, you certainly aren't faint of heart considering you tried to fight a goblin with a shed antler of all things. Arianda, who was one of the Amazons I learned about, said with a laugh. Chapter 3, Races, Shedding Rust, and Fauna. Amazons were a strange race that at first glance appeared human, but a key difference was that they all had a single defining feature: they were female. Every single Amazon was a woman, and as a race they made more of themselves by mating with the males of the other races. The scary part, however, was that despite being human in appearance, they were nearly twice as strong physically as any normal human woman with the exact same build. The next race I felt worth mentioning was one that if anything were actually disadvantaged rather than gifted as a whole, the Palams. The only greater than average innate trait that Palams had over humans that were considered the weakest race was that they all possessed sharp eyesight and can see in the dark. Unfortunately, however, the race was also on average 4 feet tall and had thin, wiry bodies that were even weaker than any average humans. Other than that, there were the usual fantasy races such as elves, high elves, dwarves, and beast folk. Elves of all types were much like all of Earth's fantasy depictions, typically fair-skinned magic wielders with long ears and a dislike of other races. Mind you, this was a cultural thing in this case and not an innate one, but I think it hardly mattered as racism was racism. Dwarves were also short, sturdy folk with an affinity for alcohol and earthen-based activities and magics. Beast folk were, and I am not being racist here as I asked, basically humans with animal features like ears and tails and sometimes rare innate traits related to their animal side. So yeah, cat girls were a thing, and they also had the whole meow speech tick as well in most cases. There was also a whole list of crossbreed species that tended to have an uncomfortable amount of human halves involved as well, but those were a dime a dozen and typically had traits of both their parent races and as such not really worth talking about. Anyway, after leaving the forest I was ple4ased to find out that the road that ran between the dungeon city of Orario and the outside world next to the forest was cobblestone and thus much easier on my feet. We were apparently a good week's walk away from the city and had nothing between here and there beyond the Great Plains that I learned was to the north of the city. At the end of the first day I decided to see about shedding my gut before we reached Orario. Like I had stated previous, I wasn't fat or anything like that, but I did have a slightly protruding belly. My smart idea was that since I had about a week of travel ahead of myself with the Artemis familia, who obviously had their shit together, I should ask if they can help me get in better shape before we got to the dungeon city. They agreed and my torment began. They are fucking demons, I swear to whatever is higher than a god. I had to run until I collapsed, and if I slowed down at all they would hit me with arrows that had the pointy bit removed and then padded. After I collapsed from running it was hydration and then push-ups, so fucking many push-ups. Finally my day ended with crunches and sit-ups until I literally couldn't move anymore. A single sip of potion later and all that bodily destruction was fixed into working order for the next round of torture. It was a hellish training regiment, and I would have reeked to high heavens if it hadn't rained and washed off the stench on me the day before we saw the city on the horizon. Despite this, however, the absolutely brutal amount of exercise and protein-rich meals from meat they had previously hunted had gotten rid of my protruding gut entirely. Now I was just thin and weak. A week wasn't enough to make a qualitative improvement in my fitness, but it did shake off the rust, as Rethusa put it. Speaking of potions, I definitely asked about that and learned some really interesting stuff about both the alchemy and oddly smith professions involved at an adventurer level. Alchemy was basically medicine making using herbs and other ingredients found in the dungeon or even in the normal parts of the world. The mortal stuff was just normal medicines, but the adventurer grade shit like what I kept sipping over this last week had downright miraculous properties when used on a normal person. Overnight overexertion repair, flesh regeneration, disease insta-fixes, and even in the high-level adventurer grade stuff limb regeneration. There was a downside, however, that put a damper on any outlandish plan I could come up with, was that potions stopped working that well on adventurers as they got stronger and reached higher levels. I don't mean levels figuratively or metaphorically here either, as the blessings of the gods were called fauna and operated on a level system suspiciously similar to a video game character's status screen. Artemis was kind enough to show me what a status sheet looked like after removing any information that was private from one she had from the last round of updates she made. Name. Race. Level. Strength. Endurance. Agility. Dexterity. Magic. Spells. Skills. Apparently the lowest a stat can be was I rank and the highest was sorta unknown, but the minimum need to level up was a single stat at B rank or 700, as each letter rank came after 100 points were in the stat all the way until you hit SS rank, which jumped up to 250 points above S, which was 901 to 1000. When you leveled up, your status reset, but it wasn't like you lost that progress or anything so much as it became your new base or foundation. Each stat point also counted for more at a higher level, as at level 2 each point was worth 1 1/4 of the same point in level 1. It was something about coming closer to divinity according to Artemis, but she was rather cagey about the details of the topic, so that was the best answer I got for why that was. Moving on, you had skills and magics, which was where things got blurry. See, skills were sort of like buffs, or in some cases debuffs, that manifest out of the power of the fauna in addition to the traits of the person whose fauna it shows up on. They can also be earned through great effort and seriously dangerous activities like soloing a boss or overcoming a crippling phobia, again vague as hell on the details about that topic. Anyways, skills could be plain like a flat bonus in a certain scenario to downright broken, such as giving a whole ass magic system or even making the laws of reality your bitch to a minor level. I was almost willing to bet my right leg that my cursed technique will get counted as a skill when I get a fauna for myself, and if not, it will be a spell. Speaking of, spells were magic. No, seriously, like it's kinda that simple. Someone could technically only have 3 spells in total. That emphasized word is very important to remember here, and what they did depended on the spell in question. In most cases, spells worked in a 3-step manner: speak the incantation, pay energy, cast the spell. This was where the emphasis on the word technically comes in, as if there is enough of a resonance between one's spells, you can mix them to create new spells that aren't actually counted as a spell beyond the 3 you have. The best example of this was the High Elf Riverial Joe's elf, who had the moniker 9 for this exact reason, as she turned her 3 spells into 9. Anyway, spells are magic as simple as that, and are either innate or you earn later via 2 methods, leveling up or magic grimoire. The later of which basically just forces a spell to manifest for you to use and has unpredictable results. Chapter 4, Leveling Up and Dark Age. Author note: this is the last info dumpy chapter, I promise. To be clear though, there is magic beyond the stuff that the fauna gives access to, but it is considered extremely inefficient and takes a long time to use for less than stellar effects apparently. When I asked how one would go about leveling up, the answer I got was a little confusing. So according to Artemis, the fauna worked by gathering excelia, which was sorta like money in that adventurers got it for putting in effort and challenging their limits through combat or crafting. It didn't matter much which it was apparently. Anyway, that excelia was then spent on improving the adventurers' stats based on this effort when their god updated their fauna. So according to Artemis, mortals could only contain so much excelia depending of a bunch of factors she refused to explain beyond one's level and innate talent. So it was sort of like mortals were a cup that you could only add so much water to before it overflowed. This all made sense and I could grasp it easily, but the next part didn't. Unlike a cup, however, a mortal can't overflow their vessel with normal excelia, which was also a condition for leveling up. Artemis was vague about it, either on purpose or because she honestly wasn't, but according to her, adventurers need to gather high excelia by performing impressive feats according to the gods in order to overflow their vessels and level up. The problem I was having trouble wrapping my head around was figuring out what scale, if any, this feat gauge was based on. Like, if a god thought you surviving another year was impressive, would that work? What about if a god never thought what you did was good enough? What then? Would you just never level up at that point? Like I said, it was a confusing answer, and even worse, apparently nobody had ever actually thought about these sort of questions, because when I shared my concerns, Artemis didn't have any way to say they weren't justified. Not to say she didn't try, because she did, but she was just as confused as I was, so it didn't really work. At least she was able to tell me what leveling up actually did besides the standard answer of make you grow up big and strong. Leveling up expanded and improved an adventurer's vessel so it could contain more excelia and in greater purity as well. The way gods understood it was that the higher the level and the more powerful an adventurer got, the closer to divinity, or arca enum as it was apparently called, they got. This made me think that if an adventurer got far enough they could themselves become a god, which Artemis agreed made sense if that was truly how the fauna worked. One would likely then ask the question, but what about demigods then? The answer of which was that they didn't exist. In exchange for coming down to the mortal realm, gods sacrificed two things while here: their power and the ability to procreate. To be more specific, the former was actually sealed and they could get rejected from this world if they released those seals. The later, however, was well and truly missing from their mortal forms entirely, which is why they tend to refer to those who have faunas as children. Quite literally, the ones who bear the fauna of a god are the closest thing to offspring they have here in the mortal world. It gave a whole new meaning to the phrase adoptive family. After a week traveling together, I was fairly comfortable around the Artemis Familia, and I am willing to say they felt similarly. That must be Orario. It's bigger than I thought if we can see it from here, I said as we crested a hill and far into the horizon stood the colossal structure. That's the dungeon city for you though. The only place in the world that you can find everything. See that huge pillar in the middle? That's Babel. Supposedly it was made by Aranos himself when he first descended to Genkai. Arianda said, explained as she walked near me. I reckon at our current speed we will arrive in another 4 hours. This should be plenty of time for us to report to the guild and get you settled. Rethusa said seriously. Much as I like roughing it out in the wild with a bunch of pretty ladies, I could definitely go for a bed right about now. I might even settle for a couch, to be honest. I joked and most of the familia laughed, and even Artemis herself had a ghost of a smile. As we got closer to the city I noticed something quite concerning: cursed energy. A metric fuckton of the stuff radiated from the city like hundreds had been killed in horrific and terrible ways. None of it was recent though, as the energy felt stagnant, like it had sat there for years already. So it didn't come up until now. But is there any topic I should avoid mentioning while in the city? You know, like a tragic event or some bad history everyone wants to forget. Got no memories, remember, so a heads up now would save me the trouble of finding out later. I said, fishing for a clue about what I was seeing. And oh boy, let me tell you, I was not prepared for what I learned. It was known as the Dark Age and was a period of 8 years starting from the failure of the Hera and Zeus familias to kill the one-eyed black dragon. That failure resulted in all the high-end power of those two familias to be destroyed and allowed the two current hegemons to step into the light after they seized power and exiled both Hera and Zeus from Orario. Freya with her powerful otter and the rest of her familia of worshippers, and Loki, who played a supporting role but still has the second most powerful familia in Orario. Sadly, those positions of power came with a terrible price, as with the Zeus and Hera familias who had reigned supreme over the last 1,000 years gone, the darkness they had kept at bay came a-knocking. Evilus. Dark or mad god-run familias whose only noticeable goal was to sow as much death, destruction, and chaos as possible. 7 years ago the final blow was dealt to Evilus according to Artemis, but the wounds they left behind still hurt even now. It was some heavy stuff and explained the cursed energy floating that blanketed the city like a fog. Knowing what I did about cursed energy though, I did wonder why it hadn't turned into a cursed spirit, but then I realized something interesting: it was inert. The energy wasn't active like it was in its usual world, and was in fact totally harmless unless something were to make it active. I won't lie and say I wasn't tempted to gather it up and use it, but I could tell that as I was right now I had no hope of containing that much energy. Chapter 5, Orario. The city grew larger and larger the closer we got to it, until I began to question whether or not the place was built by these seemingly medieval people. Reason being the nearly 200-foot-tall solid stone wall that surrounds the entire thing and was nearly as wide as a standard 2-lane road back on Earth. This city was so large that when we were standing in line to go through the gate I couldn't see the end of it by looking to either side, like it encompassed the entire side of the horizon. Apparently the wall wasn't there to protect the city so much as to keep any monsters that break out of the dungeon from escaping. I mean, it made sense, but considering the goblin I met briefly a week ago, I am pretty sure the wall failed to do its job. Anyways, the entry procedure for the city was rather straightforward, as the guards took one look at the Artemis Familia before sending us through, since they were regulars coming and going from the city. Inside the city was downright fascinating, as immediately you were hit with just endless rows of buildings of every sort of architecture imaginable. Most were noticeably made of stone and wood though, which Rethusa told me was because it was the easiest to replace in case it got destroyed. The shops, oh the shops! Every variety for as far as you could see: potions, food, clothes, weapons, you name it, and there was a shop for it right near the gate hawking their wares. Don't even think about buying anything from these stores if you value your money. Arianda warned seriously when she saw me looking around excitedly. Why not? I asked curiously. These places are newbie traps, not saying they don't sell good stuff, but it's all way more expensive than the stuff closer to the dungeon. I'll show you a couple shops that will do for you until you get to at least level 2 since they are on the way," she said with a smile. "I appreciate it," I said gratefully. "It's fine. Truth is we all feel kinda responsible for you after getting you here, you know what I mean," she said, waving off my thanks. I nodded since I could understand the sentiment fairly well. It was a bit like rescuing a baby squirrel from a felled tree until it could take care of itself. An amusing thought now that I had it, me in a squirrel costume that is. "You said you wanted to be an adventurer, right, Alex? Any idea what sort of weapon you want to use?" she asked after we left the shop conversation behind. Hadn't really thought about it, to be honest. "Hey, is punching the monsters to death an option?" I asked with a chuckle. "And not until level 2 at the earliest, and even then you'd need to specialize in strength and endurance," Arianda said after thinking about it for a moment. It was a joke on my part, so my surprise could be understood when she flat out told me that at some point it was totally doable. It basically tipped me off that any weapon was an option, as well as your fists were as raw damage as you could get with weapons being force multipliers instead. I fell into thought as a result and allowed Arianda to physically guide me as we walked. "I think I know what I want to use," I said suddenly, which caught her and the rest of the Artemis Familia off guard. "Well, don't leave us in suspense. Whatcha come up with?" Arianda asked curiously. "I think I want to use a hammer. The sort meant for 2 hands, but that has a short handle so I can use it with 1 hand," I said with a wide grin. "That's a new one for me to hear about. Can you give better details like dimensions and weight?" Arissa, a half-dwarf woman who had the blacksmith developmental skill in the Familia, asked curiously. "Do you have a piece of parchment and some coal? If you do, I think I can draw it out," I said honestly, and even though they didn't, it was an easy fix by stopping into a general goods store for them. I took the parchment and coal stick and carefully sketched out Thor's hammer from the Marvel movies I remembered. On Earth it would be impractical to use the thing as a weapon, but here adventurers were superhuman, so it was totally doable. The idea alone got me excited, and I may have gotten a little over-detailed in my sketch of the hammer. Front, side and top views were each drawn out to the best of my memory alongside the length and width of every part. When I was done, I handed the parchment over to Arissa, who looked it over with a critical eye. At first glance this design seems impractical, but if you were to turn one side into an axe head like this, it should work on any kind of monster," she said after sketching out her modification. Surprisingly, it was similar to the Stormbreaker axe Thor used in the later films, except the axe head was square-shaped like a giant wedge and the handle was much shorter, and of course had the standard Mjolnir hammer head on the other side. I loved it immediately. "That's perfect," I said with a wide smile as I admired the design. "If your first one is made out of steel, I think you ought to be able to get it for cheap. Hell, I think a few smiths would give it to you for free just because of how unique the weapon is. Bit of a warning though, you should also get some gloves or you'll shred your hands on the handle from the weight in each swing pulling at your skin. After you raise your endurance though, it should be alright to go bare," Arissa said helpfully. "Thanks for the advice, I'll try and remember it. To be honest though, I am surprised none of you are trying to convince me to use a different sort of weapon instead," I said honestly. "Nah, sometimes a weapon just calls to you and you gotta embrace the call. We could all see the yearning in your eyes just looking at the sketch. That weapon there's got your name on it, and that's a precious thing for an adventurer, shows talent," Arianda said seriously, and the rest of the Familia nod when I look at all of them, including Artemis. "Truthfully, you've got it easy since you know what weapon you want to use before becoming an adventurer. Most of us just pick up whatever we can since nothing calls to us. Means we lack the passion for the weapon that you have, and take it from me that passion goes a long way when it comes to mastering your weapon," Arissa said seriously, and many of the women grimace at the reminder. Chapter 6, Trip to the Guild. I could tell that most of them had a similar issue at some point in the past from their reaction. It was sort of funny to me, to be honest, as they could each break me in half like I was made of cotton candy, yet they had to suffer in a way I won't to get there. Not to say I couldn't relate though, as I was quite the weeb on Earth and had to my great shame tried to learn how to wield a sword at one point and failed miserably. Anyways, we headed to the Adventurers Guild after that, while a few of the Familia left to set an order on supplies for their next departure from the city, as they never stayed long. True to her word, Arianda pointed out a few shops that would work out well for a newbie adventurer as we walked. She also pointed out a few buildings I should avoid since the stuff they sold was quite dangerous, but not for the reason you might think. Soma wines are sold there. Stuff has an extremely addictive quality to it. I've seen people get turned into husks from being unable to resist the urge to get more after trying it," she warned seriously. She might as well have not said anything at all, as the higher concentration of cursed energy on those buildings alone would have stopped me from checking them out. Cursed energy is literally powered by negative emotions like anger, grief, fear, doubt, greed, envy, and so on, so anywhere that has a lot of the stuff is probably best left alone. About halfway to the guild though, I shivered as I felt a gaze land on me that felt different than normal, like all my secrets were laid bare before it. Is it just me, or does anyone else feel like they are being stared at right now? I asked worriedly, and Artemis looked concerned. It may be a god who specialized in souls, try to ignore it. She suggested, and I complied, though it was quite hard. Getting stared at while feeling naked was highly uncomfortable, and as a result tended to be hard to ignore. Thankfully it seemed to work, as the gaze vanished just as fast as it appeared shortly after that. I thought gods couldn't use their powers here. I asked, confused. We can't, but if a god is powerful enough in a certain field, they may be able to use unusual abilities despite being limited to a normal mortal body. In much the same way I myself am stronger whilst under moonlight, and my brother Apollo is stronger during the day. Speaking of my brother, you would do well to avoid him if you can, he is of peculiar tastes. Artemis explained and added a warning at the end. I will keep this in mind if I ever come across him in the future, I said with a nod. We stopped briefly at a clothing store where they bought me a pair of boots, pants, and a rough cloth shirt. It was a plain outfit, but much better than what I was walking around in before this, as I now actually looked fairly normal. Walking around with next to nothing on was an Amazonian trait I didn't feel like copying for no reason. Shortly after that we made it to Dungeon Square, which was a sort of wide open clearing around the entrance to the dungeon and Babel that had adventurers coming and going constantly. Deodorant was unfortunately not a thing with adventurers, so the whole area smelled of blood and sweat, which made it quite the stench. To my earthborn nose it was enough to make me grimace in disgust. A fact the Artemis Familia noticed and made fun of me for. Yeah, definitely going to find an alchemist to create deodorant and popularize it in the future. Maybe like a powder that keeps the smell of a hard day's delve in the dungeon from wafting off into the air. I thought seriously as we approached the large building off to the side of the square with a huge sign hanging above the doors that read Adventurers Guild. Surprisingly, the guild was very orderly and almost reminded me of a bank in a way, as adventurers came and turned over their profits from the dungeon to a teller and then got paid the market rate for them. In a different part there were members of the guild helping adventurers with gear and preparation for going deeper in the dungeon. Over to the side was a large board with parchment nailed to it that had details on requests for adventurers going into the dungeon to complete. The Artemis Familia walked up to a counter, and the teller, a mature redhead with large canine ears on the top of her head, smiled at them. Welcome back, Goddess Artemis. I take it you have completed the requests you took last time you were here, she said in a polite and friendly manner. Always, Miss Rose. This time we came across a bit of an anomaly on the way back while hunting in the forest. He seems to have been waylaid by bandits on his way to Orario and left in nothing more than a pair of shorts in the forest with a head wound that has robbed him of his memories, Artemis said while motioning to me. Alexander Drake, but I go by Alex. A pleasure to meet you, I said with a smile after stepping forward. Rose Fanet, the pleasure is mine, she said politely before turning to Artemis again. I imagine you wish for the guild to help him until he can support himself or joins a familia, she asked seriously. Artemis nodded. He has already decided on becoming an adventurer, so perhaps the easiest route would be to allow him to see a list of familias that are recruiting and set up an appointment with the god in charge of it. For lodging we can put him up at an inn room for at least a week, but will be leaving again after that time, the goddess said calmly. Rose nodded. Give me a moment to retrieve the list of recruiting familias, she said, and walked away while we waited. What sort of familia are you hoping to get into? Arianda asked me curiously. Probably one that would let me go into the dungeon by myself. I have a feeling that I won't play well on a team, I said honestly. Sounds like a small familia might be best then. Most gods tend to advocate teams if they can, and only a small familia would lack the personage to do so. I am surprised that you would want to risk solo diving though, it's not advised for a reason, Rethusa said sternly. I shrugged. Nothing for it. My gut says it wouldn't turn out very good, and I am inclined to agree. It seems to know what it's doing so far after all, I said with grin. Chapter 7, Ambition. Rethusa rolled her eyes. Of course that would be your answer. If you eventually die from following that gut of yours, know that I told you so, she said jokingly. I chuckled. Then I just need to make sure I die for some other inane reason. Oh, what about finding the one-eyed black dragon and taking a leak on it? That sounds like it would make an interesting story, don't you think? I asked with a cheeky smirk. A good death, Arianda said with a wide smile and a thumbs up. A few moments later Rose returned and set down a small ledger that was rather thin all things considered. You are in luck as the list was just updated this morning and as such has the best selection you could ask for and what they are looking for if anything at all. Rose said as she set the ledger down on the counter. May I? I asked and she nodded to give the go-ahead, so I picked up the thin book and opened it. Apollo. Size, medium. Type, exploration. Wanted, mage. Apophyse. Size, medium. Type, exploration. Wanted, warrior. Hestia. Size, no members. Type, N/A. Wanted, no specifications given. The list was fairly simple in design, but it gave most of the information someone applying for a familia might look for. I intentionally ignored all the familia looking for a specific type of adventurer since I wasn't quite sure what I would end up as after my cursed technique got usable. That sadly limited the list down to only 3 options. The Hestia familia that was clearly just starting out since it was listed as having no members. The Loki familia that only had talent as a requirement, confusingly enough. Like, how would most people even know if they were talented or not before receiving their fauna? I was a bit of an exception since I knew right away that my cursed technique alone made me considered talented, but for everyone else it was an unusual and frankly unreasonable requirement to try and match. The final option was the Maiake familia, but Artemis directly told me I wasn't allowed to join that one on account of the god Maiake being a gigolo or something like that. It was hard to tell since she muttered it under her breath while glaring at the name. In that case the Hestia familia is the only option that fits for me since the Loki familia is well known for their expeditions and teams. I said, setting the book down again. She can be a bit of a handful, but Hestia is a good choice. Artemis said with an agreeable nod. If that is your choice, I will arrange to have a meeting between you both. Please check in regularly for an update. Rose said calmly while taking the ledger back. We left after that, and unlike what I had expected, the Artemis familia didn't actually have a house that they operated out of, but rather just booked an entire small inn to themselves when they were in town. Suspiciously though, the inn in question was called the Moon and Bow and had no other customers at all. The reason for that was apparently the owner, who was a beastkin woman named Irene, used to be a member of the Artemis familia but left to pursue romance as it was forbidden to do so while in the familia. She and her husband had bought a broken-down building at the outer edges of the city that was basically abandoned and thus cheap, and ran it as an inn for newbie adventurers, and when they were in town, the woman's old familia. It was rather funny to see how the familia and the woman got along, as many of those in the familia were clearly jealous of Irene for getting hitched. Just because romance was forbidden while in the familia didn't mean those in it didn't wish for it, only that longing was outweighed by their desire to remain. It was also why I got uncomfortable originally when the Amazons of the familia first met me. The gazes they had were those of someone judging if I was a worthy candidate to be their mate. I failed in case it wasn't obvious. Amazons as a race had a type that they wanted as a husband: strong. That was it, that single word was their only real requirement in most cases. I am not ashamed to admit that I am definitely not strong at all. Hell, I never needed to be until I died and came to this world. Earth was a place where physical fitness was basically pointless if you weren't an athlete of some sort or enjoyed exercising. You simply didn't need above average strength unless you fell into those categories. Why would I go out of my way to work out and eat healthy when all it accomplished was determine whether or not I lived a slightly longer miserable existence? So I simply lived my life day by day, as I saw no point in caring beyond that. Here though, godhood was an actual possibility, one that a bona fide goddess had confirmed was possible but unlikely. Regardless of how unlikely it was, I wanted to chase that possibility with everything I had. Suffering was inconsequential in front of such a lofty goal, and I knew it. But like any earthling will tell you, that was a long-term goal, but in the short term I needed to set more reasonable goals. My current goal is to work on my fitness and join a familia to get a fauna. After that I will spend however long and however much effort it takes to hone my skills and power to perfection. The best part is that I am actually fairly certain that if I expand my cursed technique enough, I can also earn a fortune by creating weapons and armor unlike anything this world has ever seen before. I knew this because I had taken a look at the weapons and armor of the Artemis familia and got a rather curious piece of information from my technique's instinctual understanding: they were made of parts taken from a living thing. Drops they are called, pieces of a monster that remain even after the rest of the body turns to smoke from the magic stone being damaged or removed. Smiths in this world could apparently turn these drops, if they were the correct sort, into weapons or armors. These equipment were also much more resilient and powerful than normal metal weapons usually. In fact, almost any gear for an adventurer beyond a certain level of power required these drops to be made. My cursed technique as a result made me uniquely suited for the smith profession, but that would be a cop-out on my part. While there was no shame in sitting in a forge all day and crafting things like literally every other smith in this world, that was not a path to godhood. Far too many had traveled it for that to be true. No, I needed to go beyond the normal and into the realm of the extraordinary to even have a sliver of a chance at reaching my goal. Chapter 8, New Familia. It was frankly kind of sad how little variation there was in adventurers in this world from my understanding. Most walked a path that was nearly identical to that of someone who came before them. Train, delve, relax, level up, repeat. It was this same monotonous pattern over and over again for the vast majority of adventurers who weren't crafters. The problem was that it simply stopped working at a certain point and you needed something to keep the adrenaline coming. I had used my time with the Artemis Familia to understand that following someone else's path simply didn't go anywhere. No one else seemed to understand this, however, if what I understood from the girls of the Familia was anything to go by. Despite nearly 2 decades having gone by since the fall of the Hera and Zeus Familius, the highest any adventurer had gotten was level 7. In comparison, the Zeus and Hera Familius even had level 8 and 9s in them, while level 7s weren't uncommon apparently. It wasn't a matter of age either, as those same level 9 and 8s had been only 40 or so from what I gathered by asking around. They had also apparently held these levels for a few years as well, so I would guess they were at most 35 or so when they reached them. In comparison, Otter had been level 7 for 7 years now and was 32. The information I got on him was mixed though, as some thought he was purposefully preventing himself from leveling up to 8 for some reason, while others thought that was his limit. If the former was true, then I truly wished to know what it was he was waiting for. If the later was true, however, I had a hard time not considering him rather pitiable. Anyways, I spent the night at the inn and slept like a brick the moment I touched the bed, after cleaning myself with a bucket of hot water, bar of soap and a clean rag. Showers were apparently only for those with a lot of money, since the ones in this world ran off of magic stones. Apparently fucking everything ran off magic stones collected from the dungeon. It was nice to know that I could make a living by delving at least. Perhaps not a great one until I got stronger, but enough to survive at least. Want to go check in with the guild to see if they have gotten a hold of your soon-to-be goddess? Arianda asked over breakfast of oats with fruit. I nodded. I'll probably make a habit of that until you guys head out again and spend the rest of my day trying to learn as much as I can about the dungeon to prepare. I said honestly. A solid plan. If you are in luck, you shouldn't have to wait very long to meet your new goddess and get a Falna. Rethusa said, approving of my plan. After eating, Arianda and I headed out to go check the guild for an update, while the rest of the Familia scattered to make the most of their time in Orario. If I had to guess the time based on the sun, I'd say it couldn't be more than 2 hours since sunrise. That was a sleeping schedule that I had needed to get used to with the Artemis Familia over the last week and day, waking up when the sun came up and going to sleep when it fell. That was a rough transition, let me tell you, and not one that the Familia took any pity on me with. It was wake up, eat, exercise until I dropped, sip potion, dinner, repeat, all starting from the first rays of the sun touching this part of the world. The funny part was that I was always so exhausted by the end of the day that trouble getting to sleep because it was early by Earth standards wasn't even an issue. Anyways, I had adapted within 5 days of that schedule, and now I doubted I even could sleep in longer than maybe an hour or two past dawn now. Orario was much more lively at this time than when we arrived yesterday, as adventurers headed to wherever it was they needed to go, which was probably the dungeon. Food vendors were trying to tempt people into buying their foods, while stores had people hawking their wares. All in all, it was just as you might imagine a bustling city to be during the day. The guild was surprisingly empty at this time though, but I suppose that made sense, as most adventurers were heading to or were in the dungeon at this point in the day. When we walked in, I immediately noticed a goddess was present, just from the sheer otherworldliness that all deities seemed to have. She was fairly short, to be honest, at about 4'7", and had a disproportionately large bust that didn't fit her petite body at all. She had long black hair that was tied up into twin tails with white ribbons and a flawless pale complexion. You are in luck, Goddess Hestia, the one interested in joining your Familia has just walked in. Rose, who was dealing with the goddess, said calmly. What? Where? The goddess asked eagerly as she turned to look around, and I raised a hand. Yo. I said with a smile. She smiled widely and rushed over, but almost tripped in her excitement, so I had to catch her. Easy there. I'm not going to vanish, I promise. I said with a chuckle as I hoisted her to her feet. How embarrassing, I got a little ahead of myself there. My name is Hestia. The small goddess introduced herself, eagerly holding her hand out. Alexander Drake, looking forward to working with you. I said, shaking her hand with a smile. That was pretty much how I ended up with my goddess from that point onwards. The guild registered me as being in the Hestia Familia and assigned Rose as my advisor, though she was very unhappy with it. Arianda congratulated me on joining a familia and lead me and Hestia back to the inn where Hestia and Artemis hit it off immediately as old friends from heaven. There was a bit of a celebration that the familia hosted in mine and Hestia's honor since we were both broke as hell. At the end of which they revealed that as a gift they had gotten me my weapon based on my designs and a pair of leather gloves in secret to surprise me. Honestly, they were great friends to have and I thanked them a whole bunch with a huge smile for the rest of the party until it was time to head to my new home that Hestia had. Apparently I underestimated exactly how bad the financial situation was, as the home in question was an abandoned and in heavy disrepair church at the base of the wall, also known as the Forgotten Area. Chapter 9, Status and Experimenting. If I take some of the decent wood from the nearby abandoned buildings, I should be able to at least fix most of the damaged parts, I said as I looked over the walls of the church after arriving. You know how to build houses? Hestia asked, surprised and strangely excited. Not really, but this isn't building a place from the ground up but merely replacing damaged parts. Since the boards are bare, I can just replace each of the damaged ones by pulling out some nails and putting a better board back in its place with those same nails if they aren't rusted through. I explained honestly. That does seem doable now that you mention it. Maybe we should wait until we can afford to get professionals to do it though, she said, clearly reluctant to do any renovation without the assurance of it turning out okay. I shrugged. Your call. I'd be fine either way since it looks good enough to stop the rain and cold from getting us in our sleep, I said honestly. Righto, now hurry up and get undressed so I can give you my blessing, she said cheerfully. You could have worded that better, but at least I know what you mean, I teased, and she looked confused for a moment before turning red when she figured out what was wrong with what she said. Just take your shirt off and lay down already, she ordered, embarrassed, as we walked into the church's basement that had a couch and a bed, and that was about it really, besides the bathroom. If you say so, I said as I took my shirt off as ordered, and I noticed the curious look she threw the tattoo-like marking on the front of my torso. I had it when I woke up in the woods with no memories about a week ago, so not much I can really explain about it since I myself have very little to go off of, I explained honestly as I laid down on the couch. The guild employee told me about that. It sounds horrible, she said sympathetically as she sat on my back. I would have shrugged if I could have. It's not that bad really. Then again, the Artemis familia were quite helpful at answering any questions I had. Surprisingly enough, not having any memories is actually rather freeing, since without a past I have nothing stopping me from moving forward, I said honestly. It was true too, as I had no family, friends, responsibilities, nothing at all that could weigh me down. I could truly be considered as at rock bottom, but that simply meant the only way I could go was up. Hestia seemed to appreciate the sentiment, if the way she hummed was any indication, before I felt a drop of something warm fall on my back. The room lit up as the fauna formed and began to take shape on my back. At first it was just like an intense heat flowing through my body from my back, but as soon as it touched the symbols on my chest and stomach it turned scorching and painful, causing me to grit my teeth and clench my fists. Is this normal? Nobody told me it was supposed to be painful, Hestia said, panicking once I started to show pain. The painful heat dulled after about 10 minutes, and all I was left with was a tingling sting like I had a bad sunburn all over my body. Irritating, but something I could deal with without much issue. I think it's over now, I said honestly. Are you okay? You are burning up under me, she asked worriedly. Really? I feel like I have a sunburn, but otherwise totally fine. Maybe it's a skill of some sort, Artemis said, that happens sometimes, I suggested, while surprised to learn my body temperature was so high. Did she? I guess she would know more than me about it, what with you being my first child and all. Give me a moment to copy your status to a piece of parchment and we can go over it together, she said, getting up and rifling around in a bag over in the corner, where she eventually pulled out some parchment and set it on my back and did something with her finger. All done, she said, and I got up before putting my shirt back on. Name, Alexander Drake. Race, human. Level 1. Strength 10, I. Endurance 10, I. Agility 10, I. Dexterity 10, I. Magic 10, I. Spells, Hell's Forge. Innate technique, can use anything from a living being and reshape or refine it per one's will. Incantation, Hell's Forge. Skills, Heavenly Restriction. In exchange for the ability to wield mana and magic, one gains access to cursed energy and cursed techniques. Is this bad? And what's cursed energy or techniques? Hestia asked, confused. It doesn't sound bad at all, though that part about not being able to use normal magic stings a bit. Also, I am pretty sure cursed techniques are just ways to use cursed energy, which seems like a replacement for mana. Let me give it a try, I said seriously and held up an hand and began to concentrate on it. At first nothing happened, but as I got more and more frustrated a dim black and bluish glow started to come from my hand, but it vanished the moment I got a rush of excitement. Not really all that impressive, is it? Hestia asked with an awkward look. It seems to rely on my own negative emotions to manifest right now, but maybe that's just because I am not very skilled with it yet. I said without having any clue if I am right or not. It certainly sounded right given what little I actually knew about cursed energy from the anime. Like you could have a lot of cursed energy but not be able to use it very well or at all, like Yuji at the start. I see. And what about this spell Hell's Forge? Do you think you could use it? Hestia asked, finding what I said reasonable. I need something from a living being, but I think so. Do you think wood counts as something from a living being? I asked with a grin as I had an idea. My goddess obvious didn't see my grin as she thought about the question for a moment before saying, trees are alive, so I think so. Why? If I'm right, we may not need to wait that long to fix up the church. Help me find a loose piece of wood to try the spell on, I said, and she brightened up as she realized what I had thought of. It only took a small amount of time to find a piece of rotted wood that had fallen from the walls up top. Here goes something, Hell's Forge. I called the incantation and immediately felt a harsh draw on my energy stores as a bright black and blue flame came out of the hand holding the wood and fully covered it. I pictured an image in my head and willed the spell to work, and slowly but surely the wood began to transform until I was forced to stop barely halfway through as I felt my energy get dangerously low. The flames vanished and I felt drained, but couldn't help but grin widely as the rotted wood was now nearly pristine and pointed like a stake at one end. It works, I said excitedly. Chapter 10, Grinding. The wood was still horribly rough and definitely not anything like the image I had in my head, but it still proved that my idea was feasible. Are you all right? Hestia asked, far more concerned about me since I was slouching from exhaustion as most of my energy had just been consumed. I'm fine. Just a bit drained is all, but look, it worked, I said, showing her the wood. She studied it carefully. Well, it isn't rotten anymore and the shape is a little different, but it's kinda rough, isn't it? She asked, confused. That's actually my fault. I didn't realize just how fast using the spell would drain my energy and only had enough to change it to this point, I said honestly. I see. This looks like a really useful magic and it's pretty too, congratulations, Hestia said with a bright smile. Thanks. I bet if I focus on repairing the church bit by bit I can train my magic stat really quick, I said with an eager grin. You aren't going into the dungeon? Hestia asked, surprised, and I shook my head. Not yet, I need to raise my stats first through good old physical training, or I am like as not just going to struggle pointlessly. Unlike most newbie adventurers, I have actually seen a goblin before and I know for a fact fighting just one of them would be a struggle for me at the moment, not to mention according to the girls in the Artemis Familia the things rarely are alone, I said seriously. Better safe than sorry, she said, agreeing that my plan made sense. After that we went to sleep with her in the bed and me on the couch that was not the most comfortable but not horrible either. Unfortunately, I learned a rather bothersome fact about my goddess when I woke up in the morning. She was clingy. Sometime in the middle of the night she had gone from the bed to on the couch using me as a body pillow. Let me tell you, there is nothing more awkward than waking up with morning wood only to find that a small but beautiful woman was rubbing on it unconsciously since it was poking her in her sleep. Even worse was when she woke up and realized what she was doing shortly after you did. The silence was deafening. We ate a couple pieces of cheap bread with tomato red faces for about 30 minutes before she went off to her day job selling Jag-American, which were basically potato croquettes or deep-fried breaded mashed potatoes with salt or sometimes meat. I, on the other hand, found an exposed board in the upstairs chapel room and poured most of my energy into it to try and restore it to perfect condition. That lasted for all of about a second before I was out of energy, because as it turned out, size does matter when it came to how much energy something took to change with my cursed technique. While I was waiting for my energy to refill, I got to work working out with my new weapon. Since I was going to be carrying the thing around constantly in the dungeon, it only made sense that I also worked out with it so that I could get accustomed to handling it. For example, I went jogging and carried it with me despite my body not liking the misplaced weight at all. My legs were used to carrying some extra weight from the gut I used to have, but my arms were screaming in pain as I jogged. I had to switch hands a few times before my legs were also burning from exertion and I was out of breath. After that was crunches to work on my core strength and then practice swings with my weapon to work on my form. Let me tell you, swinging a 20-pound object with one arm without losing balance was not easy at all with average human strength. I stumbled and fell several times, but I was stubborn like that and never stopped until my arms were both feeling like jello. Ignoring my own pain, I dragged my weary body into the church, and after depositing the weapon bellow went back to the wooden board I had worked on previously to burn through my refilled energy pool again. Once that was done, I sat on the floor next to it to wait for my goddess to return while using any energy I refilled during that time to slowly, bit by bit, restore the wood to perfect condition. Hestia returned about an hour or so before the sun went down with a bag of leftover food from her stall that hadn't been sold. "Are you going to be okay?" she asked worriedly when I groaned and shook while standing up. "Yeah, I'll be fine, just feeling the pain that comes with working out is all," I said reassuringly, despite knowing I probably overdid it. No, I definitely overdid it, as after eating I went to sleep and woke up feeling like I went 5 rounds with Tyson. I spent the next 3 days recovering while using my cursed technique every chance I got. Waking up every morning with my goddess using me as a body pillow had also sort of become a habit we didn't talk about ever. She wasn't flirting or anything like that, which was the only reason I knew that she wasn't doing it intentionally and chose to just go with the flow and ignore it as a result. My next workout session on the 4th day was much more relaxed than my first, and I stopped the moment my muscles started to really ache. I was making good progress on repairing the church though, as I had fully restored exactly 2 wooden boards for all my effort. At the end of the week Hestia updated my fauna and I got to see if it was worth it. Name: Alexander Drake. Race: human. Level 1. Strength 10, I, 47, I. Endurance 10, I, 83, I. Agility 10, I, 39, I. Dexterity 10, I, 24, I. Magic 10, I, 179, H. Spells: Hell's Forge. Innate technique, can use anything from a living being and reshape or refine it per one's will. Incantation: Hell's Forge. Skills: Heavenly Restriction. In exchange for the ability to wield mana and magic, one gains access to cursed energy and cursed techniques. Honestly speaking, I wasn't surprised at all to find that my fasted growing stats were magic and endurance, considering what they represented. Each stat in the fauna had specific purposes and thus got increased by performing actions related to them, and endurance was your stamina and literal toughness stat. By overworking my muscles I had seriously pushed the stat forward, since I had overwhelmed my body's natural durability. As for magic, that was basically increased by simply using as much mana, or in this case cursed energy, as possible and working the power to its fullest at level 1. Increasing the magic stat also had the wonderful bonus of also increasing one's efficiency and volume of energy. Chapter 11, Grinding, 2. It wasn't a massive increase right away, mind you, as that wasn't how fauna worked, but over the next few days my body would adapt to my increased stats and I would be quantitatively superior than I am at this moment. As I said though, my body would need a few days to adapt to my new stats, so that meant there was no real point in updating my fauna again until that point. Even then though, I would want to wait until I felt I had made decent progress before I did it again. I also knew that as my stats got higher and higher I would need to push myself much harder to see any improvements, and even then it would be very slow. I wasn't sure when exactly the cutoff point for easy stat gain was, but I wanted to use it to my benefit while I could. "You really worked hard, hey?" Hestia asked with a proud smile as she looked over my status. "I certainly tried, though admittedly I was a little too overzealous about it at first," I said with a grin. "Does this mean you will be going into the dungeon now?" she asked worriedly. I chuckled. "I don't plan on even attempting it until I reach at least G rank in all my stats, so you don't need to worry your pretty little head about it until then, okay?" I said, and she smiled and nodded. After that we went to sleep and got into our routines over the next week that I could subtly but surely feel the incremental adaptations my body was making to my higher stats. My energy pool increased but double its original amount, which sounds like a lot, but it was still effectively useless for any real length of time. My raised endurance stats had basically convinced me that it was the best stat of all, as I could jog longer, do more crunches, swing my weapon more, and I recovered from my workouts faster. My understanding was basically that more endurance meant more stamina to raise all the other stats minus magic. In that regard I began slightly overworking myself with every workout so that stat would get a bigger than normal boost on my next update. I did make sure that I was only slightly overworking my muscles though, so that by the next day I could still work out. My magic stat was also likely to gain a large boost again, as I emptied my energy pool the moment I filled it to repair the church. There was a slight issue I quickly noticed in the form that while my volume of energy increased, the speed it was restored had not grown to match that increase, though it had grown some. In addition, while I could use cursed energy without my technique, I was still having trouble controlling my emotions to do so, and hadn't had any success doing so without negative emotions yet. Not for a lack of effort, mind you, but I was sort of winging my control at the moment, so obviously I was making slow progress. Cursed energy didn't exactly come with an instruction manual, and unlike in the anime, I had no one able to teach me how to use it properly in this world. This wasn't all bad though, as while I had to struggle more to grasp it by myself, I also didn't have anyone to try and limit my potential with false information. As far as I knew, cursed energy had no limits, and I was working with that as a premise for my practice. This time I waited until 2 weeks had passed before I asked to update my status again, during which point my daily exercise was starting to show gains. My body's muscles were slowly and imperceptibly growing more defined as time went by, and by the time I asked for an update I was starting to gain the faintest hint of a six-pack and strong limbs. My biggest issue at the moment was definitely diet though, as I was barely able to support these gains with what we ate. Name: Alexander Drake. Race: human. Level 1. Strength 47, I, 115, H. Endurance 83, I, 167, H. Agility 39, I, 101, H. Dexterity 24, I, 78, I. Magic 179, H, 272, G. Spells: Hell's Forge. Innate technique, can use anything from a living being and reshape or refine it per one's will. Incantation: Hell's Forge. Skills: Heavenly Restriction. In exchange for the ability to wield mana and magic, one gains access to cursed energy and cursed techniques. As you can see, I had raised all of my stats except dexterity to at least H rank, which was not bad at all for being an adventurer for 3 weeks without going into the dungeon once. It would have honestly been much faster had I gone into the dungeon though, since Falna worked by converting Excelia to stats, and without actually killing anything I had no real Excelia to transform. You passively generated some when you exerted yourself as I had been, but you got far more via life and death combat like that found in the dungeon. You should work on your dexterity some more, it's lagging behind the rest of your stats. Also, is your magic stat supposed to grow this fast? Hestia asked, concerned. I think it might be a hidden bonus from my skill. It does remove all chances of me learning any normal magic, so it might compensate by making my magic stat grow faster than normal. As for dexterity, I am not entirely sure how to train that stat. Do I just like stretch, or is there more to it? I said, honestly confused at the end. I will ask my ache, maybe he knows. Hestia said casually. My ache? I think he was on the list of Familius recruiting at the guild, but Artemis said I couldn't join him for some reason, I said curiously. Tomu, he is very good with women and had many partners in heaven, so Artie-chan didn't like him all that much. He's not a bad guy though, unlike Zeus or Hermes, who are real perverts. Hestia said honestly. A personal bias that makes sense. If you say he's a good guy, then he must be worth knowing, maybe introduce me. I said with a smile. What about your training? She asked with a frown. Bah. One day won't make any difference, besides maybe he knows a better way to train my stats than what I have been doing. I suggested, and after some thought she nodded in agreement. Chapter 12, A Possible Use. We ate dinner after that and went to bed like normal, and in the morning we both set off for the blue pharmacy that Hestia said was where my ache usually was. The forgotten area was just as bad as you might expect somewhere with that name to be, as there simply wasn't many people living there, what with the area basically being abandoned and run down. I spotted a few places as we walked that I noted mentally for looting later, since they had inorganic parts that I would need if I wanted to fully repair the church. Namely, glass that was still intact or mostly intact that sat in the empty building's windows. The church's glass is broken in every window, and since my technique didn't work on stuff that didn't come from a living source, I needed unbroken glass to repair them. As a positive though, when I did go to replace the glass in the wooden windowsills, I could stylize it up by having the wood form around the glass as though the trees it came from had a glass pane perfectly set between two pieces. Honestly, I was halfway tempted to remove all the inorganic parts of the church over time and just fuse the wood of the walls and roof into a big-ass tree. Unfortunately, Hestia very much disliked that idea, so I could only chose to put it off until I could purchase the cheap land and buildings around the church and slowly bring my vision to life over time as we expanded. Soon enough we reached the small and clearly understaffed blue pharmacy shop. Ah! Goddess Hestia, welcome. My lord has not informed me of you coming to visit today, but then again he does many things I am not the biggest fan of. A dog-beastkin woman with a sleepy expression and slow way of speaking said when we came in. This was a sudden decision on our part actually. I said, clarifying that my ache hadn't known we were coming. I see, you are the newbie Hestia has been bragging about for the past few weeks then. The woman asked casually while looking me over. Alexander Drake, a pleasure. I said, introducing myself politely. Naza Irisus, I look forward to your business. She said with a predatory look. Not unlike the gaze one might expect from a conman who was after your money. I was unbothered though, since it didn't matter so long as I never fell for whatever tricks this woman pulled out of her sleeve. Could you let my ache know we are here please? Hestia asked, and Naza sighed but left to do so. A few moments later a handsome man with dark blue long hair and matching eyes walked out the back doorway. Like every god I had met so far, he had this sort of otherworldly vibe to him that made it hard to not notice his deific status. Good morning Hestia, Naza said. You wanted a bit of a chin wag? My ache said with a slight Irish-sounding accent and curious expression. Omu, we wanted to get your advice about raising stats since we are a bit lost on it ourselves. So far Alex has been working out and using his magic as much as he can, which has gotten him to H in all but one of his stats, but we weren't sure how to effectively raise dexterity. Hestia explained, and my ache had an understanding look. Has he gone into the dungeon at all? My ache asked, and we both shook our heads. I see. In that case exercise is the best way to raise most of the stats. As for dexterity, maybe try stretching or something that requires precision with the fingers. Naza here makes potions, and that stat is usually her fastest to grow as a result. Some of the best potions in Orario, in fact, my father said so himself. My ache said proudly, while Naza blushed at the praise while her tail wagged a bit. Diansec did? Must be true then, since if anyone do know it would be him. Hestia said, impressed. Yes, I couldn't be prouder of her. But I couldn't help notice you mentioned Alex here has magic, if you don't mind me asking, what it is. My ache asked curiously. It's a bit vague, but from what we gather I can manipulate, refine, or restore anything from a living thing. I said honestly, since my goddess trusted him I felt I could at least attempt to do the same. Could you regrow an arm by chance? My ache asked hopefully. No clue honestly, but even if I could I doubt I can at the moment anyways. The spell is an absolute energy hog. From what I have found, the larger or more complex the thing I am using it on, the more expensive it gets. I said honestly. Would you mind giving it a go if we gave you some potions to restore your mana then? My ache asked, much more excited looking. I looked at Hestia. Can we tell them about the skill or no? I asked, since that was entirely her call. Yes. She said before looking at my ache and Naza, but both of you have to promise not to share this information with anyone else first. She said seriously. You have my word Hestia. My ache said firmly, and Naza nodded in agreement. I don't use mana, or rather I can't use it due to a skill I had the moment I got my fauna. Instead I use something called cursed energy. As a result I don't even know if a mana restoring potion would work on me. I revealed, and both my ache and Naza looked shocked. Sounds like there's more to that skill than you have said, but we won't pry. Still, your concern is well warranted. Mana potions have been specifically designed with mana in mind, so we have no idea what might happen if you drank one. Best case scenario, the potion works without a hitch for your cursed energy just like it was mana. Worst case though, it will cause your body to have mana and cursed energy clash until the effects wear off. If you are willing to try it with a weak mana potion, we can find out. My ache said with a suggestion at the end. Hestia looked at me in concern as I nodded. If I am going into the dungeon eventually anyways, I should know whether or not I should carry some mana potions with me. I said honestly. My ache nodded in understanding. First you need to empty your energy like anyone using a potion would normally. He said seriously. I need a target for my cursed technique in order to do so. I said honestly. My ache scrounged around for a bit before coming up with a blue leaf that was withered and dry. Would this work? He asked, and I nodded as he handed it over. Hell's Forge. I spoke the incantation, and my ache and Naza flinched slightly as the blue and black curse flames sprung to life over the leaf. I focused on refining the leaf, adding moisture, and removing impurities, that sort of thing, while my energy plummeted in about a second after I started. Chapter 13, Over Limit. I finished up right before I fully ran out of energy and handed over the leaf that now looked like it had just been plucked from the plant and had a slight gleam to it. My word! This is one of, if not the best looking azure leaf I have ever seen, and so fresh as well. My ache said with an impressed expression that Naza also shared. I would hope so, it took nearly all of my energy to make it like that. What is that leaf even used for anyways? I asked curiously. It's one of the primary ingredients for the elixirs that restore even high-level adventurers' health and mana. Usually they are controlled heavily by my father's familia. But I managed to get a dried leaf from the market that I haven't been able to use until now, since as it turned out the leaf's properties are held within its juices. My ache explained without looking away from the leaf. No wonder it was so expensive to restore and refine despite only being a single leaf. I said, rather surprised at the true identity of the leaf. So long as mana potions work on you, I have no doubt that you ought to be able to regrow Naz's arm with your spell. My ache said after carefully storing the leaf again. Wait a second, what do you mean regrowing Naz's arm? Doesn't she have 2 arms already? I asked, confused as hell. Naz grimaced but rolled up her right sleeve to show that the perfectly functional arm she had was in fact a prosthetic that was made of a shining silver metal. I was shocked, since when fully covered like it was, I thought it was a perfectly normal arm, as it perfectly matched her other and moved smoothly and quickly. It's so convincing. I truly, though it was a normal arm, I apologize for the discomfort. I said honestly. It's not your fault, since I try to keep it hidden, and it is a top-of-the-line prosthetic from the Dian sect familia after all. Naza said, waving off my apology. I am going to be honest, I am unsure whether my technique will work on you, since you are a living thing and not something taken from a living thing but not alive like that leaf. I am willing to test if I can use mana potions if you are willing to accept that possibility. I told her seriously. I am willing to make that gamble, she said with a determined look. My ache nodded in agreement before reaching over to the nearby shelf and taking off a single vial of yellow liquid the color of a banana but that was as smooth as water. This is a low-level mana potion, try taking a small sip of it to see if it has any effect, he said as he handed it over. I looked at my goddess and carefully took off the cork sealing the liquid in before pouring a small amount in my mouth and swallowing it. It tasted of bitter medicine, which was unpleasant but something I could handle. We all waited with bated breath to see what would happen, but I didn't feel any different than normal. Is it supposed to take this long? I asked, and before I could get an answer there was a change. In my reservoir, energy started to pour in like a wave, quickly filling it to the brim, but that was when a problem came about. It didn't stop. I started to feel a bit bloated, then I started to feel hot, and finally my body began to exude cursed energy and I panted like I was burning up, and judging from the expressions on everyone's faces I must have looked like it too. Haha, much energy. Haha, need to vent, I said, panting heavily as I grabbed Naza roughly Hell's Forge. I spoke the incantation before anyone could stop me and began to will the cursed technique to restore her arm. My cursed flames burst to life on Naza's body and she grit her teeth in pain, but her shirt at the shoulder began to tear as her body began to slowly regrow the arm that was once there. The prosthetic that was taking up that space, however, was getting pushed away by the newly regrown flesh and bone, thus the shirt was ripping from the pressure. Naza resolutely tore off the fabric and prosthetic with her left arm, and the regrowth, now unobstructed, accelerated drastically. My energy reservoir concerningly never dropped below halfway for the entirety of the regrowing process, despite my technique literally burning through it at a staggering rate. In the end, Naza was left with a brand new arm that mirrored her other. I was still overflowing with cursed energy though, and had to make a desperate gamble to get rid of it. I tried to force it out of my body without negative emotions. It was hard to describe, but it felt like I was pressing against a barrier with the energy until the pressure was too much and the barrier was shattered and my cursed energy flowed freely out of my body in a violent burst. I didn't realize it, but the cursed technique markings on my stomach and chest began to expand at this moment, and black tattoo-like bands appeared on my shoulders and 2 sigils came into existence on my shoulder blades. At this point the energy finally stopped surging into my reservoir and I felt lightheaded for a moment before collapsing. That was my first experience with the common magical phenomenon known as Mind Zero, which happened when a mage used more magic than they can handle in a short period of time. In my case, I had used the equivalent of 20 times my current max energy amount in all of a few brief minutes. Ugh, my fucking head. I groaned when consciousness finally started to return to me. Easy lad, you are suffering a nasty case of Mind Zero. Give it a few minutes and the headache will ease up a bit, my ache said as I went to sit up. Alex. I heard Hestia yell before feeling a softness covering my face and suffocating me alongside a weight on my chest. Pretty sure she's suffocating me in her boobs. I am strangely okay with this, I thought, despite tapping out in hopes of someone saving me. The weight vanished and I could suddenly see and breath again, which was nice, I suppose. Looking around, I saw Naza holding a struggling Hestia while my ache just had this amused look on his face as he gave me a sly wink. I'm fine, Hestia. Well, I could really use some water, but I don't think it'll kill me to wait, I joked, despite it feeling like I had a gorilla punching my brain. My goddess was released and thankfully didn't try and smother me to death this time, but settled for a concerned hug. It was nice to be cared about like this. Warm, I suppose, is a good way to describe it. Chapter 14, Dilution and Potion Idea. I must say, lad, your reaction to that mana potion was quite unexpected. From what I could tell, you were literally overflowing with energy, something that should be impossible, my ache said seriously. What do you mean? I asked, confused while giving up on prying my goddess off me since she had me in a death grip. Mana potions, no matter how good, are only supposed to refill the drinker's mana. The leftover effects of the potion are wasted after that. In your case, however, the small amount of a low mana potion you swallowed not only refilled your energy but also exceeded your maximum amount as well, and not by a small amount either. It's just my theory, but I think that it has something to do with that skill of yours. Maybe what it actually does is convert any mana in your body to this cursed energy of yours, and so the potion kept trying to refill a mana reservoir that was perpetually emptying. He explained seriously. If the conversion of mana to cursed energy was efficient enough, that might explain why I got so much out of so little as well. I said, finding his theory reasonable. Indeed. Speaking of, can you try and guess roughly how much the small amount of the potion you drank gave you, so that Naza and I can try and make a diluted version that would be safe for your consumption? My ache said, and I was surprised by the offer. I might be a little off, but around 20 times my previous full amount. After that experience, however, I imagine my magic stat will increase drastically. I said honestly. My ache nodded before starting to mutter with Naza over the right amount to dilute a mana potion by to achieve the same effect as a normal low-grade potion. To me though, it was a bunch of nonsense that I couldn't understand at all. Sounded like chemistry, and I flunked that class by a lot. Choosing to stop wasting my time with the two potion makers, I turned my attention to the more pressing matter at hand, a certain clingy goddess. Hestia, could you perhaps let me go now? My headache is going away, but you don't exactly weigh nothing, you know. I said, and I could have sworn that I saw a vein pop on her forehead. Are you calling me fat? She asked with a dangerous glint in her eyes. I shook my head vigorously. Not at all, but I am rather uncomfortable like this. I said honestly. While she was fairly soft, that didn't mean having 95 pounds of goddess sitting on your chest was fun. She looked a little peeved, but still got off me, which was a literal weight off my chest, and let me finally sit up. As my ache promised, my headache was easing up over time and was now much more manageable than say 5 minutes ago. I remember that something had happened to my cursed energy just before I passed out from Mind Zero, but I wasn't going to risk it by experimenting until I was clear of my current condition. You had me terrified when you burst into flame like that. I thought you were going to die. Hestia spoke and got teary towards the end. I reached out and rubbed the top of her head. While I am happy you care so much, have some faith. I am nothing if not stubborn, and won't let just anything claim my life, you hear me? I asked with a confident smile. Omu, I'll find your soul and torment you for 1,000 years if you leave me for no good reason, understood? She asked with her own smile. Sounds like a drag. I think I'll pass. I joked and we both laughed. Good to see you are back to fine spirits. Naza and I are done figuring out how much we should dilute a normal mana potion. With the information you gave us, this new diluted potion should restore your reservoir and not overflow it by more than a small amount at most, which will be fixed as your magic stat increases. My ache said after we finished laughing. Thanks for the trouble, just let me know what I owe you and I'll pay you back when I can. I said thankfully. I meant it too, since it was better for me to have found out about my sensitivity to mana potions in a semi-controlled environment rather than by chugging a full undiluted potion in the dungeon and exploding pathetically. I might be wrong, but I am pretty sure the only reason I didn't explode from the small amount I drank earlier was because regrowing Naza's arm was just that expensive. By my calculations, the amount of energy I used was the same as I would normally have at H rank magic at level 2. In other words, I had used way more cursed energy than I had any business with at my current level of progress. It probably wasn't a pointless amount of danger I suffered, even if we disregard Naza's new arm, as since I had pushed my energy and technique beyond its current limits, my stats were likely to show great improvement on my next update. It may even be enough to be time for me to enter the dungeon for the first time. My ache interrupted my thoughts with something that caused my brain to short-circuit for a second. Oh no, we could never accept your money after you risked so much and gave my child back her arm, and I pray her hope as well. All your potions at the Blue Pharmacy will be free for as long as you come here. He vowed solemnly. As you can imagine, I had trouble accepting this vow, as it made no sense logically and could even be considered foolish from a business standpoint. Wait. While I appreciate the sentiment, that is far too much to accept. How about you give me free mana potions, since those should be the cheapest to purchase since they are so heavily diluted? Ah. Wait, can I request a custom potion as well, one that if you succeed will bring you a great deal of money? I spoke hurriedly while getting a great idea towards the end as well. We can accept the mana potions being given for free, since as you said, them being so diluted makes them much cheaper. What is this custom potion though, and how would it bring us a bunch of money? Naza asked before my ache could speak again. Have you ever gone through the dungeon square when people are coming from the dungeon? I asked and they both nodded confused. I continued at this point. Then you are likely familiar with the stench they leave behind as well. My idea is a potion that removes this smell or at least hides it until the adventurer can bath. If you advertise correctly, I can't see why this wouldn't immediately become a big hit in the city and perhaps further. Chapter 15, Control and Possible Profit. Both Myaik and Naza looked intrigued by the idea. A potion that removes or suppresses one's odors until they bath. At first glance this appears to be a frivolous and pointless thing, but I remember smelling foul after returning from the dungeon, so I can see the appeal. Naza said seriously, and Myaik nodded in agreement. We would need to do some experimenting, but I believe your idea should be achievable within a month. Myaik said seriously. That'll do perfectly. Make as much as you can and store it away, and once you have enough for a few hundred people at minimum, let one of us know so we can start advertising it. I said seriously. A few hundred? It's not possible that so many would want it, is it? Myaik exclaimed in shock. I chuckled. You seem to heavily underestimate just how much an adventurer reeks after a long day delving. Besides a few nut jobs with some screws loose, the adventurers that put up with the stench only do so because they have no choice but to do so. We change that, and I am almost willing to bet my left arm that you'll see more business in a single day than you have in years. I said with a grin. You don't seem to be lying, so I'll take your word for it on faith, but know that I doubt it will come to pass as you have said. Myaik said skeptically. Hestia and I left after that before heading home, since it had been a good few hours between us traveling to the pharmacy and me getting overloaded with cursed energy. I was apparently knocked out for 2 hours due to the severity of my mind zero state, and as a result we only had at most another 3 hours of daylight left. An hour of that was used just getting back to the church, with the last 2 being us eating some cheap food we got from a vendor who was about to shut down their stall for the day. Hestia needed to shell out some of her savings for the food, but I promised that we would be better off once I got started in the dungeon. I meant it too, as that place was a veritable treasure trove for my cursed technique. From drops to the monsters themselves, I highly doubted that I couldn't find a way to earn a hefty profit from the place. That was just on the first few floors, mind you, as I was curious if the unique metals taken from deeper in the dungeon could also be manipulated with my technique. My thought on that was that if the dungeon truly was a living thing like many believe, then those metals should technically count as being from a living being and thus subject to my technique. Even if that wasn't the case though, I still win, as I can finally put that theory to rest entirely. Anyways, we went to bed for the day and woke up nice and early like usual the next day. Holding out my hand, I willed my cursed energy to come forward, and to my surprise blue and black flame-like energy appeared without any issue at all. So that breakthrough I felt was my body becoming better at moving and controlling cursed energy. I thought as I moved my hand around, and the cursed energy flickered and swayed as though it was truly flame. Focusing hard, I began to try and move all the energy to a single finger of my hand, but failed as the amount of energy dropped when I attempted it. I was stubborn though and sent more energy to my hand before trying to stuff it all on a single finger again. I continued this until I ran out of energy before starting my workout to get my other stats moving as well. For my dexterity, I took my weapon and grabbed a piece of wood from a broken up building near the church to begin trying to carve. Fun fact: trying to carve with an axe head is no simple feat and prone to failure, but damn good practice controlling fine movements. A single twitch in the wrong way and all my work up to that point was ruined and needed to be undone with my cursed technique. This practice was a great way to practice fine control of cursed energy as well, since I was trying to limit the amount of area my technique touched to only the ruined part. Interestingly, I discovered that if I used my technique on 2 separate things, I could in fact fuse them together, which meant any wood I shaved off accidentally could be added to the piece I was carving again. By the time Hestia came back, my block of wood looked like some eldritch creature had gotten a hold of it. It sucked. Then again, I had literally just started learning how to carve and was not using the best possible tool for this sort of thing. I should really get a knife for this kind of thing. Maybe I can make one if I get lucky and get some goblin teeth. I thought as I wolfed down 3 of the fried potato things with ham that Hestia brought back for us. Hey Hestia, do you know any butchers in the city, specifically the sort that might have bones they have no use for? I asked, having a really good idea suddenly. I think there's one a bit down the street from my stall. Why? She asked curiously after swallowing her bite of food. If I can get some bones, I can use my cursed technique to refine and shape them into stuff you can sell. Things like bone chimes, rings, necklaces and bracelets. You can definitely sell them for a decent bit on top of your Jagamericans. The best part is if anyone asked how they were made, you can be honest and say a spell did it. I said with a grin. Her face brightened as she smiled. That might work. I'll try and convince the butcher to let me have some bones tomorrow. It doesn't matter what condition they are in, right? She asked, and I shook my head. After we finished eating we went to bed eager for the next day, since if everything worked out we could improve our financial situation some with the sale of these bone items. I didn't even want her to sell them for a whole lot of money either, since they would likely come from free bones anyways, and I was more than happy for the practice with my technique. Obvious the better quality ones with more details and nicer appearance would be sold for more money, but I doubted many would buy the stuff as anything more than a nifty trinket. I spent the next day the same as I spent the previous and made a small amount of progress with my cursed energy control. When Hestia got back she had an extra bag that was filled with broken bone pieces that looked as though someone had taken a hammer to them. Chapter 16, Figurine. I am not talking about like if a butcher accidentally hit a bone with a cleaver and we only got the shard that came off. No, I mean it was clear that these were pristine and solid bones that someone had intentionally busted up. Before I lost my temper though, I made sure to ask Hestia what the deal was with them. Thankfully I did too, as she explained that the butcher busted them up since he said it would be easier to stew for broth that way. It was a simple misunderstanding on the butcher's part rather than any malicious thoughts. Taking the bag from her I set it down while we ate dinner before grabbing 5 shards of bone and activating my cursed technique. The flames covered the bones and I managed to fuse them into a single orb the size of a muscadine grape before my energy ran out. It was rough and had several cracks, but it was just a base for me to work with. I'll probably need a few days before I have any amount worth selling, so by the time I get my next update then. I said honestly, and Hestia nodded. Do we need to worry about health issues with these bone pieces? She asked, but I shook my head. After refining them with my technique they will not have any flesh or bacteria on them, so they can be considered mineral in a way, no different from rocks you might find on the ground. I explained calmly. Why? Aren't flesh and bacteria considered from living things as well? She asked, a little confused. They are, but the way my technique refines things is by simply removing whatever I don't want and perfecting whatever I do want. In this case the flesh and bacteria are unwanted and as such will be burned away. The only real limitation I have is my own understanding of the thing I am working with, as well as my imagination. I explained with a smile. She seemed happy with that answer and we went to bed shortly after that. The next day she left for her job and I went to work refining the orb of bone I made the previous night until I was out of energy. Then I started my physical exercise and pushed it a bit harder than normal, as I had noticed that as my endurance stat went up it took less and less time for me to recover from merely sore muscles. Not by a lot mind you, but enough that I could go just smidge harder than would be a good idea for a normal person. After my workout left my body burning I sat down and went back to working on the orb. One more refinement after that and the bone orb was ready to be shaped. The bone was now flawless and had a dull but eye-catching whiteness to it that was nice to look at by itself. Once my energy refilled naturally I began to shape the orb into a small humanoid form, but with thin gossamer insectoid wings on its back outstretched as if to fly. That alone took me nearly 4 whole amounts of cursed energy to complete, simply because of how detailed I made the figurine. I made realistic wings, body shape, and a pretty little face with short hair tied up in a bun. I made a small figurine of Tinkerbell. It was only about an inch tall, but the level of detail alone was enough for me to be confident that at least someone would be interested in it. Just before Hestia would normally be returning I had the brilliant idea to add a small but noticeable symbol on the thigh of the figurine. This was a simple maker's mark that I would be putting somewhere on all my works from now on. Shortly after I began to fuse some more bone shards together into another orb. Hestia returned and saw the figurine. So pretty, she said, fawning over the thing in awe. I don't want to sell anything sub-par, so I spent a good bit of effort on that little trinket. You can sell it for however much you'd like after I make 3 more. If they are not very popular I will switch to something else like jewelry, I said, not really caring all that much since with my cursed technique I can always make more. How could this not be popular? Do you even see how pretty it is? She exclaimed, like the mere idea that the figurine wouldn't be popular was blasphemy of the highest order. I mean, yeah, it's nice to look at, but it's not all that useful, is it? I asked, confused why she was acting like this. This was the city of adventurers after all. While I might be wrong, I sort of doubted an adventurer would spend a bunch of money on something that serves no purpose beyond looking nice. I certainly wouldn't, but then again I could be totally wrong. Hestia didn't try and argue with me about it, but said that she'd take it with her tomorrow but not to sell. I didn't see any issue with that and dug into the food she brought before heading to bed. Like she said, she took the figurine with her in the morning and I repeated the process I went through the previous day to refine an orb of bone before shaping it into a figurine with my maker's mark. It was surprisingly easier than before, ever so slightly, which I was sure was because I had experience this time. I didn't make Tinkerbell this time but took the same body shape and modified the face, clothes, and hair so it was another fairy entirely in a different pose as well. I wanted to try and keep from using the same design more than once unless someone asked for it. When Hestia returned she had a massive smile and a small bulging sack of coin in her hand that caught me off guard. Hestia, where did you get that bag of Valis from? I asked with a sneaking suspicion that I knew the answer already. I took the little fairy up to my stall and had it sitting at the front and someone noticed it and asked if I was selling it. I told them I wasn't but they really wanted it and soon there was a whole crowd of people offering a bunch of money for it. She said all excited about her day. I deadpanned at her. You sold the figurine didn't you? I asked calmly and she nodded. For 12,000 Valis. When I said I would have more soon the crowd went nuts. She said with a wide smile. I wanted to be mad, really I did, but 12,000 Valis is not a small sum for people in such dire straits like us. Valis was the currency in this world and was represented in 3 different denominations: gold, silver, and bronze. Bronze coins were worth 5 Valis, silver coins were worth 20 bronze coins and gold coins were worth 100 silver coins. That sack had 1 gold coin and a bunch of silver ones in it. To make things clearer, a loaf of white bread cost between 10 and 20 Valis and a gourmet meal may cost at most 6 or 7,000 Valis for really high-end but normal foods like caviar. Chapter 17, To the Dungeon. A meal made from dungeon ingredients, however, could go as high as 500,000 Valis. Needless to say, I was quite justified in my shock at the amount of money we got all of a sudden. Who the hell just carries that much money around? I asked, genuinely confused. I don't know who, it was just that everyone seemed afraid of him. Hestia said honestly. Can I get a description? I don't think that just anyone commands that sort of acknowledgement. I said with an ominous feeling in my gut. Well, it was really big Boaz with short hair and he felt like really strong. Hestia said, trying to be helpful. Well, the good news is that I think I know who that is, but the bad news is we really don't want his goddess's attention. I said with a tired sigh. Is he famous or something? Hestia asked, confused why I sounded so worried. Famous doesn't even begin to cut it. If I am right, that is the most powerful adventurer in Orario, otter of the Freya familia. I said honestly. Hestia stiffened. Why in heaven's name would someone like that be in the stall area? She exclaimed. I am not personally acquainted with the man, but from what I have been told there are 2 reasons I could think of. First, that he had business elsewhere and was passing through but noticed the figurine and thought Freya would like it. The second was that Freya herself saw the figurine and told him to go get it for her. Either way, I am debating whether or not to even give you any more of the things since we can't withstand the attention of a familia like that. I said seriously. But the money? Hestia asked reluctantly. It's your call, but I will keep making the things if you still want to sell them. Though I suppose it'll take a while longer since I will be going to the dungeon tomorrow since today is update day. I said with a shrug. Whatever choice my goddess makes was obviously going to be the way we deal with things, since despite her being a bit carefree she had a pretty good head on her shoulders. Besides that, I couldn't be bothered to focus on anything beyond personal growth and left it to her as the head of the familia. Oh yeah, that was today, wasn't it? Excited to see how much you've grown? Hestia asked with a playful smile. Always. Every single point is just another step towards my ultimate goal. I said with my own smile. Name, Alexander Drake. Race, human. Level 1. Strength 115, H-256, G. Endurance 167, H-312, F. Agility 101, H-221, G. Dexterity 78, I-201, G. Magic 272, G-627, C. Spells, Hell's Forge. Innate technique, can use anything from a living being and reshape or refine it per one's will. Incantation, Hell's Forge. Skills, Heavenly Restriction. In exchange for the ability to wield mana and magic, one gains access to cursed energy and cursed techniques. Like I had expected, I had reached G rank in all of my stats and even exceeded it in endurance and magic. Reaching C rank in magic was a little shocking, but considering what I had to go through to get there, I was not surprised all that much. More likely than not that would end up being the first stat to reach the limit of 999, at this rate. I can't really explain why, but the idea of that being the highest possible amount before you have to level up bothered me. Like the Falna was supposed to eventually in theory turn a mortal into a god, so why was the limit so low? It didn't make any sense to me, but I suppose I wouldn't ever get an answer to that question. We ate dinner and went to bed after I got my update, since we would both be leaving the church tomorrow. She would be taking my new figurine to the market with her, which was not the best idea, but I couldn't really argue with it as we were hurting financially at the moment. Unlike usual, when I woke up in the morning, I didn't plan to stay near the church but rather was going to swing by the blue pharmacy to grab some diluted mana potions and check on things there before heading to the dungeon. Orario was always so busy early in the morning as people moved about to complete errands or head to the dungeon or open shop. As I moved through the crowds towards the blue pharmacy, I couldn't help but be excited by the idea of my first real adventure. It wasn't going to be some epic tale of conquest or anything, since I wasn't going to go any further than the first couple of floors that only had goblins spawn in them. I was hoping to get some teeth to drop naturally before I began to experiment with my cursed technique on the dead bodies to see if I could increase the drop rate that way. In theory, I could actually just turn the entire body into a drop by simply transforming it with my technique without taking the core from the body. That was definitely going to cost way more energy than it would be worth though, so I wouldn't be trying that anytime soon. After about a 30-minute walk at a relatively fast pace, I reached the My Egg Familia shop and opened the door, which set off the ringer. "Welcome back, Alex. Here for some potions, I take it?" Naza, who was sitting behind the counter, said in a friendly manner. "Good morning, Naza. How is that arm treating you?" I asked with a smile. She flexed the new arm a couple times. "It lacks any muscle memory, so I am having to retrain it all from scratch, but it works just like it is supposed to," she said honestly. I nodded. "I am not surprised, since it is a new arm and not the one you lost, so obviously the muscle memory is missing. Still, it is good to hear that there is no problem with it. I need a couple of diluted potions since today is my first time going to the dungeon and I want to be prepared," I said casually, and she moved to get my order. She put 3 vials on the counter though, which confused me since one of them was green while the other 2 were the expected watery yellow. "This one is a healing potion. The first dive can be a bit rough, so you may take some scratches or scrapes," she explained, and I nodded before carefully putting the potions away in a small sack that Hestia bought for carrying stuff in. "See you later," I called with a wave as I left the shop and started to make my way to the dungeon at the center of the city. On the way, I bumped into a girl carrying a paper bag of ingredients which spilled onto the ground. She had grey hair and eyes and looked panicked when the stuff fell on the ground. "Ah, sorry about that, here, let me help you," I said, embarrassed, and bent down to pick up the stuff on the ground. Chapter 18, First Delve. I picked up all the produce from the ground and put it in the bag. "Oh no! The tomatoes have gotten bruised. Mamma Mia is going to kill me," the girl said, fussing over the bruised red fruit. I held out my hand. "Give them to me and I'll fix them up for you. It's the least I can do after accidentally running into you like that," I said honestly. The girl looked confused but did as I asked, and with a quick application of my technique the tomatoes were as good as ever, and I had even improved the flavor by a small amount. "Your magic is beautiful and useful. Would you consider working at the Hostess of Fertility?" the girl asked with a bright smile. "Not for me, I'm afraid. I'm an adventurer at heart. Thanks for the offer though, and please do have a good day," I said before hurrying away as I was still very eager to get into the dungeon. The girl seemed nice and all, but I had better things to do than socialize. After rushing for a good 40 minutes, I finally reached the entrance to the dungeon. It was under the Tower of Babel and had 2 guards at either side of the door who were ignoring everyone entering the dungeon, which made me think they were here more for the monsters than the people. The entrance to the dungeon itself was a winding, rough stairway that appeared to have been carved from the walls themselves. Unlike most people think, the first floor of the dungeon actually had a bunch of different zones that could be found via the doorways along the walls of the stairs, but all lead to the lower floors eventually. I, like so many other adventurers, chose a random entrance and entered the first floor proper. The layout of the first few floors was the same, with it having dark stone walls like that of a cave, but strangely weren't pitch black at all for some reason, and you could see easily here. I immediately walked over to a wall and put my hand on it and trying to activate my cursed technique, but I got no response, but not for the reason I had expected. I could feel that the dungeon was alive, or at the very least had something indistinguishable from it, but my technique was simply unable to affect the thing. If I had to explain, it was like my technique tried to attach itself to the dungeon but simply couldn't get a grip, if that makes sense. Despite this, however, the dungeon clearly didn't appreciate the attempt, as the walls crumbled and 5 humanoid creatures with green skin and wooden weapons came from them, goblins. I cursed and quickly drew out my weapon before rushing at the first goblin nearest to me that was still disoriented from just being born. Swinging wide with the hammer part, I connected with the side of its head. Crunch! I flinched as I felt the flesh and bone crack and shatter on impact through the hammer. It was a sickening sensation for someone who had never killed anything intentionally before like me, but I didn't have time to contemplate it as the rest of the goblins yelled and charged at me. The first goblin was obviously dead, considering I had collapsed its skull with my very heavy weapon. I knew from the Artemis Familia that monsters in the first 4 floors weren't much more durable than a normal human, so it honestly wasn't that difficult to kill them quickly if you hit the right spots. Of the 4 remaining goblins, it was one with a wooden club that reached me first, and the thing viciously leapt up and tried to crack my own skull with the thing. I dodged to the side and swung my axe head side at the goblin's side, which I immediately regretted as the ribs crunched and split with blood pouring out, and this awful sound from the lung getting crushed came from the goblin's mouth. The weight of the blow sent the creature sprawling to the side, making a terrible gurgling sound as it tried and failed to breath. Again, I had no time to deal with the mental pressure this brought to my mind as the next 2 goblins arrived, one with a sharp wooden spear and one with a club. My only saving grace was that these things were wild and didn't work well together. The spear goblin tried to stab me, but the club goblin got in the way, ending up getting stabbed in the back. It got hit in the perfect location for the magic stone to get hit, which killed the thing instantly, and it exploded into black smoke with red sparks in it. Unlike what I was expecting, however, where the smoke would just clear out like the Artemis Familia had told me, it instead got sucked into the tattoo on my chest. The fuck? I thought in complete confusion, but snapped out of my shock when the spear goblin didn't stop trying to kill me. The last goblin that also had a spear caught up, and I had to play dodge the stabby sticks for a good 5 minutes with not great results before I got an opportunity to crack my hammer side against a skull again, leaving me to deal with only 1 goblin. The last goblin had no sense of self-preservation and went to stab me again, but I frankly had had enough of getting cut up by barely dodging the things, and after avoiding the spear, grabbed it with my left hand and activated my cursed technique. Immediately the wood that the goblin was holding grew spikes through its palm, making it scream and try to drop the spear. Taking advantage of this distraction, I stepped forward with my weapon and brought it down as hard as I could onto the last goblin's head. The skull was totally demolished with blood pouring out everywhere as the goblin's body dropped. My senses were alive as adrenaline coursed through my veins, and I was gasping and panting heavily in exhaustion. It took 5 minutes for me to recover and start to calm down, and another 30 to stop vomiting as my mind caught up with the brutal nature of what I had done. Don't get me wrong, I understood the necessity of it, but that didn't mean actually doing the stuff wasn't hard on the mind at first. The fact I had basically killed 4 things at once definitely hadn't helped at all. If it was only 1 like I had originally planned, then it wouldn't have been so bad, but I pissed off the dungeon a little and got 4. Next came the really uncomfortable part though, magic stone collection. Monsters all contained magic stones somewhere in their body, usually the chest, that you needed to harvest or risk a variant showing up, which was a mutation of a normal monster that grows by eating magic stones. Interestingly, a monster's body won't vanish until the stone was harvested, and drops don't appear either. Chapter 19, Variant. I walked over to one of the bodies and gagged, but rested my hand on its face. Hell's Forge. I spoke the incantation and blue and black flames came to life from my hand, covering the goblin's body. I focused only on the part that normally dropped, however, and used the technique to refine the teeth ever so slightly before cutting off the energy as I was getting low. Steeling myself, I raised my weapon before bringing it down right on the goblin's chest with the axe side. The ribs split open to reveal the magic stone that was intact, and trying not to throw up again, I reached into the cavity and tore it out, causing the body to burst into smoke and embers that got sucked into my tattoos. Well, at least I know that wasn't just a freak incident now. I muttered as I tried to sense if there was anything different about my tattoos or body, but there was nothing at all. The magic stone in my hand was bloody and about the size of my thumb, but perfectly intact with a shifting smoky-looking energy within its black crystalline form. On the ground though, I saw something that improved my mood immediately, a full set of teeth that were white. Before jumping to any conclusions though, I went through the gruesome and unsettling process of extracting the stones of the other 3 goblins and didn't get any drops at all from them, which told me that I was right. If I refined the drop before harvesting the stone from an intact body, I could get that drop guaranteed. The next step, however, was checking if the teeth I got this way were the same as a normal drop, which meant I unfortunately needed to go hunting for more goblins. I didn't need to worry about blood though, as with a quick flex of my cursed technique it all burnt away. Once I mentally prepared myself, I walked further into the dungeon to search for more goblins. The monster spawn rate in the dungeon was based on the power and depth the monster was on. As a result, the dungeon churned out a new goblin once every 20 minutes or so, which was why adventurers weren't constantly fighting over the things if they were even hunting them. After reaching level 2, which was a point most people easily achieved in time with effort, most adventurers ignored the goblins because they weren't worth fighting. Then of course you had the second sort of adventurer that killed everything that moved and ignored the dropped stones, despite the fact that doing so could result in a variant popping up simply because it was unprofitable. I unfortunately came across one such variant this dive, though it was thankfully a new one and not out of my strike range, but definitely close. See, I was prowling the stone path of the dungeon when just up ahead I saw the damn thing. At first I thought it was a person because it was about as tall as the average human and had pale grey skin, so I thought it was just some shirtless dude down here. I was wrong. The variant seemed to sense me and turned before I could call out in greeting, and my voice died in my throat when I saw the face of the variant. Long canines and bloody red eyes that made me think of a predator staring at prey. "Oh shit!" I shouted as I quickly reached into my pouch and took out a mana potion that I popped the top off of and down the moment I realized what I was not more than 15 meters away from. There was no saving the vial though, as the variant charged rapidly with a rusty sword in hand, which forced me to toss it and focus on the threat. Graya! The thing screamed viciously as it swung the blade so fast that I barely dodged it by leaping to the side. I need to grab it, I thought, immediately recognizing that I was outmatched in physical stats. Magic though? Oh, I had some real nasty ideas about how I could use my cursed technique in battle. Admittedly, one of them was to straight up rip off Mojito and transfigure my opponent in a way that renders them harmless, or at least less likely to harm me. In this case I was going to seal the goblin's mouth and nose before letting it suffocate to death. I know, really fucked up, but you couldn't convince me that the alternative of this thing probably bringing me to the point of near death from a direct clash would be a better option. I figured out how I was going to grab the variant in no time at all, and I was frankly not that thrilled at the idea, but it was admittedly the best I could come up with. When the variant charged at me again, I steeled myself and moved towards it instead of away. I didn't get stabbed or slashed, thankfully, as I wrapped my arms around the thing like a very aggressive hug before activating my technique. I definitely got slashed across the back after that, however, as the cursed flames consumed the goblin variant and its lips and nostrils fused shut and it tried its hardest to get me off. Once my work was done, I punched the variant in the nose as hard as I could before distancing myself. I could feel the cut on my back, but it didn't hurt too much thanks to the adrenaline, and while the variant clawed at its face after dropping its sword, I snatched said weapon. I couldn't help but grin when I held it, as my technique told me it counted as from a living thing. Reaching into my pouch, I grabbed the health and mana potion before downing them both and putting the empty vials back. I felt an itch from my back and my energy reservoir threatened to overfill since the effects of the previous potion I took were still in effect. This time it was intentionally done as I activated my technique and began to refine the sword so that it became a guaranteed drop. Once I felt I had done enough, I crossed my fingers, prayed to Hestia, and used my cursed technique on myself to try and heal the cut on my back. The pain vanished, as surprisingly the technique didn't hurt me at all when I used it on myself. Even more surprising was that the energy burnt by the technique was the lowest it's ever been, and I suddenly realized I had been putting the carriage before the horse. My technique was meant to be used on me, but using it on things outside myself was the extension of the technique and thus a massive energy sink. Looking at the variant that had collapsed at this point with a blue face and was in its final throes as the life fled its body, I sighed and walked over to it and sank its own blade through its chest to retrieve the magic stone. Chapter 20, Guild Trip. When I retrieved the stone, the variant burst into a much bigger than normal cloud of smoke that had blue embers in it rather than the red of the normal goblins. The stone was also 3 times bigger and clearly of a higher quality. The smoke got sucked into my tattoos again, but this time I actually felt a difference. It was hard to describe, but it felt almost like a drop of liquid had appeared in my mind. What it meant and what uses it had I wasn't sure about, but it certainly didn't feel like it was a bad thing. Anyway, I got the sword as a drop, and to my surprise the variant's entire skull. It honestly looked almost like a human skull, but the details were off and the mouth full of very sharp teeth said otherwise. Still, I bagged the thing since loot was loot and it might prove useful later. After this encounter I was firmly and completely done with this delve and started heading back to the surface. I had to hang the sword awkwardly from my hip since it was a raw blade without a sheath, but nobody said anything, so I just rolled with it. I headed over to the guild nearby to sell my loot and verify whether or not the goblin teeth I had still counted as drops. The place was absolutely hopping with activity, as many other adventurers also came to turn in their loot for coin. I quickly found my way over to Rose's counter that was mostly empty. "Yo!" I said cheerfully, and the werewolf woman glared at me. "Oh well, if it isn't Mr. Drake, who I haven't seen since I was assigned to him and I thought died in the dungeon. What can I do for you today, sir?" she said in the most passive-aggressive manner ever. Okay, that's fair, I probably should have checked in, but I was busy training really hard before I went into the dungeon. Got all my stats to G before I even stepped foot in the place, a decision I am happy to say was a damn good one. Today was the first time I delved, in fact, and I even came across a fucking variant goblin of all things. Probably some asshole left stones on the ground without care if I had to guess. I vented my sorrows to the woman and she gave me a weird look like I was missing some screws. "So you haven't been delving the whole month?" she asked, suspicious. Now I was training my stats up to G first and getting a hang of my weapon and magic. Today was the first time I've actually stepped foot in the dungeon and I got ambushed by 4 goblins, then I ran into a variant bastard. Hold on, I think I already mentioned that. I said with a pause towards the end. I would like to say you have a good head on your shoulders, but I think you might actually be insane. Also, you said you came across a variant goblin? Can you describe where and what it looked like so the guild can issue a quest to exterminate it? Rose said very seriously towards the end. Oh. There's no need, I already killed it. Speaking of, I have some drops to turn in. I said before digging out the skull so I could get to the teeth and stones at the bottom of my bag. Rose just stared at the skull dumbfounded while I did this, and she wasn't alone as some other people had taken notice of the skull as well. I set all the teeth on the counter before putting the skull back in the bag since I was going to keep it for personal use. Here we are, 12 goblin teeth and 6 magic stones with 1 broken and 1 from the variant. I said cheerfully as I handed over my loot. So you actually fought a variant and won? Rose asked astonished. I am pretty sure it was a newly evolved one, but I did, yes. I said, nodding in confirmation. I see. She said neutrally as she moved on to testing all the loot, and I was especially worried about the teeth, but they passed inspection just fine. The variant stone is approximately equivalent to a grade 3 stone or a stone from an ogre for a value of 2000 valis. The teeth are worth 50 valis apiece for a total of 600 valis. The broken stone is worth a flat rate of 50 valis. Each normal goblin core that is intact is worth 100 valis for a total of 400 valis. Your complete turnover is 3050 valis. Is this acceptable? Rose said, breaking down the going price of things. I nodded. Yep, that sounds good, thanks for the help. I said with a smile. Rose just looked at me blankly before counting out the coin and putting it in a small bag that she handed to me. I left the guild after that and totally missed Rose gawking at the slashed bloody back of my shirt. On the way back I was called out by the girl who I bumped into hours beforehand and helped with the produce. Hey! Over here! She called, and like anyone would at that sound I looked, that was a mistake. She rushed me, and before I knew it all my valis was gone and I was eating a hearty meal at a restaurant and bar called the Hostess of Fertility. It was a quaint little place that made me nervous as hell for one reason: every single person there save one was level 4 minimum. The owner was a massive dwarven woman who was level fucking 6. The food was good and all, but I didn't want to find out what happens if I criticized the food and kept my mouth shut about it needing some salt. I made sure to take some food home for Hestia since I thought she'd appreciate it, and said goodbye to the girl who I learned was named Seer. The owner Mia had apparently heard about my magic from Seer and offered to pay me to swing by every day in the morning to enhance the flavor of the ingredients after the tomatoes I had improved earlier proved to be a big hit when used. I was honest and said I'd try to stop by when I could since I could always use the coin, but that I might not make it since I'd be hitting the dungeon a lot more. That answer was easily accepted and I was told it was an open offer. I wasn't sure, but Seer seemed pleased with the whole arrangement, but then again I was about as versed with the opposite sex as a rock. I was damn good at treating people like I wanted to be treated, but that just meant I wasn't hard to get along with. I avoided romance like the plague it is though, and was perfectly happy being a single man forever.
Thanks for listening.